You won't believe what happened the very first day my wife and I were moving into our new lake cabin, because it all started with excitement, turned into chaos, and ended with a twist that even I couldn't have predicted. The morning was bright and cool, perfect for moving, and we were unloading boxes from the back of our truck. My wife had insisted on carrying the heavier ones herself, saying she didn't want me doing all the lifting, while I tried to keep things organized on the porch. We had been dreaming about this place for years, a quiet retreat by the lake where we could finally escape the noise of the city. But as I placed the first box down by the door, I heard a sharp voice, the kind that makes you stop in your tracks before you even register the words. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" It was the kind of voice that dripped with authority, even though it had no right to carry any. I turned, and there she was, Karen. Arms crossed, lips pursed, eyes squinting at us like we were criminals caught red-handed. She looked as if she had been waiting all morning for the moment someone stepped foot on what she considered her turf. She didn't even give me a chance to speak before she jabbed a finger toward our moving truck. "You can't just move in here without HOA approval." "Who gave you permission?" "I didn't." I tried to stay calm because moving day is stressful enough without getting into a shouting match with a stranger. "Ma'am, this property isn't under your HOA, I said evenly. "We've signed the lease directly with the owner. We're well within our rights to be here." But Karen wasn't the type to listen. Her nose wrinkled like she had just smelled something rotten, and she pulled out her phone. "That's not how this works," she snapped. "I don't care what papers you signed. Around here, I make the rules, and you two clearly don't belong." Before I could respond, my wife came out of the truck carrying a big box stacked with kitchen supplies. She gave Karen a polite smile, the kind you give someone just to avoid escalating things, and walked past her without a word. That seemed to ignite Karen's fury even more. She gasped dramatically, clutched her phone tighter, and hissed, "Don't you dare ignore me." She dialed right there in front of us, her voice rising as soon as the line connected. "Yes, this is an emergency. I need officers sent to Lakeshore Drive right now. There are suspicious people trespassing, stealing, possibly squatting on private property. Yes, they're here right now. Hurry." I stood frozen for a second, shocked at how quickly this was spiraling. My wife shook her head and muttered under her breath, "This woman is unbelievable," before carrying the box inside. I didn't want to lose my temper, but my patience was hanging by a thread. "Ma'am," I said firmly, "we are not trespassing, and making a false police report is a serious offense." But Karen waved me off like I was nothing. She stepped closer, glaring at the open door where my wife had disappeared inside. "You people think you can just move in and do whatever you want? Not in this neighborhood. Not on my watch." Her arrogance was almost laughable if it hadn't been so maddening. She started circling the driveway like a guard dog, muttering to herself, then raising her voice every few seconds as if rehearsing what she'd tell the cops when they arrived. "They look suspicious. They don't have approval. They must be stealing. They're probably dangerous." Each accusation was louder and more dramatic than the last. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I knew better than to argue with someone like her. People like Karen thrive on conflict. She wanted me to snap, to give her more ammunition, but I wasn't going to hand her that victory. Meanwhile, I noticed some of the neighbors peeking through their curtains, curious about the commotion. A few even stepped onto their porches, whispering to one another, clearly used to Karen's antics. One man shook his head and mouthed, "Good luck," as if warning me that this was just the beginning of life with her in the neighborhood. I exhaled slowly, trying to remind myself that this was supposed to be a good day, the start of something new for us, not a battle. But standing there, listening to Karen continue her tirade, I couldn't help but wonder if we had just moved into a nightmare instead of a dream home. Finally, Karen snapped her phone shut and smirked at me, arms crossed again in smug satisfaction. "The sheriff will be here any minute," she declared, her voice filled with triumph. And when they get here, you're going to regret ever setting foot on this property." She looked so confident, so certain that she was about to have us dragged away in handcuffs, that for a second I almost laughed at the absurdity. My wife came back out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans, and asked me calmly, "Everything okay?" I nodded, but Karen cut in before I could answer. "No, everything is not okay. You people are criminals, and the law is about to deal with you." My wife arched an eyebrow but said nothing. She picked up another box, hefted it onto her shoulder, and walked right past Karen again, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. That quiet confidence only made Karen fume harder. She muttered insults under her breath, calling us freeloaders, liars, even thieves, her voice dripping with venom. And yet, what she didn't know, the thing that made me almost want to sit back and grab some popcorn, was that the moment those flashing lights appeared, the entire situation was going to flip upside down. She thought she was in control, but the truth was she had no idea who she was really dealing with. Within 10 minutes of Karen's frantic call, the familiar flash of red and blue lights painted the street outside our new cabin. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath its tires announcing its arrival like a drumbeat in a parade. Karen straightened instantly, her smug grin spreading as though she had just summoned an army to her side. She waved her arms dramatically, nearly running into the road as the deputy parked. "Over here, officer. It's them. Right there, in that house," she shrieked, pointing at us as if she had uncovered a major crime ring. The deputy stepped out of the cruiser with the calm, methodical pace of someone who had been through this routine before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing mirrored sunglasses that reflected Karen's frantic face as she all but danced in place. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He simply looked from Karen to me, then to the open door of the cabin, where boxes were stacked neatly inside. "Ma'am, please step back," he said firmly, holding up a hand. His voice was even, professional, but Karen immediately tried to override him. "No, no, you don't understand. They don't belong here. They broke in. They're stealing. I want them arrested right now." The deputy raised an eyebrow, turning his gaze toward me. "Sir, can I see some identification?" he asked. I nodded, already pulling my wallet from my pocket. Karen looked like a child who had just unwrapped a gift on Christmas morning. Yes, check their IDs. "You'll see they're lying," she urged, practically bouncing on her heels. I handed over my license, and the deputy studied it carefully. He asked a few standard questions, my name, where I lived before, who the property owner was, and I answered them calmly, without hesitation. He didn't seem alarmed at all. If anything, he seemed mildly annoyed that his morning had been interrupted for something this trivial. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She stormed closer, gesturing toward the truck parked in the driveway. "Check their truck. I bet it's full of stolen stuff. Look at those boxes. No one moves in without HOA approval. They're probably squatters, criminals, maybe worse." She leaned in toward the deputy like she was feeding him state secrets, whispering loud enough for me to hear, "They don't even look like they belong in this neighborhood." That last line made my jaw tighten, but I stayed silent. My wife had warned me before we moved in that people like Karen often tried to provoke reactions just to make themselves look justified. The deputy glanced at her, his expression unreadable behind the mirrored shades, then turned back to his cruiser to run my information. Karen smirked again, looking directly at me with a sneer. "Say goodbye to your little lake dream," she taunted. "By tonight, you'll be gone." And then the front door opened again. My wife stepped outside, carrying another large box in her arms. She moved with purpose, her posture straight, her eyes calm as always. She set the box down gently on the porch and brushed a strand of hair out of her face. The deputy froze. For a moment, his body stiffened as recognition sparked across his features. Then, almost instantly, his demeanor shifted. He removed his sunglasses, his eyes wide, and in a crisp motion that silenced everyone on the street, he saluted her. Karen's grin collapsed so fast it was almost comical. "Wait, what are you doing?" she stammered, her voice cracking. She looked back and forth between my wife and the deputy like she was trying to make sense of a puzzle she couldn't solve. My wife gave a small nod, acknowledging the gesture, and said quietly but firmly, "At ease, deputy." The tone of her voice carried weight, the kind that came from years of command, and suddenly the air felt different. Karen's face twisted in confusion and disbelief. "Why are you saluting her? She's just carrying boxes." "She's nobody," she exclaimed, her voice louder than ever. The deputy lowered his hand, now standing straighter, his tone more respectful. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I suggest you watch your words very carefully." But Karen wasn't ready to back down. She jabbed her finger toward my wife. No, you don't get it. This is my neighborhood. I'm the HOA president. Nothing happens here without my say-so. I don't care who she is. She doesn't belong here. Neither of them do." She puffed out her chest as if her self-given title meant more than it did, but her voice trembled ever so slightly. My wife stepped forward then, her presence commanding even without a uniform. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her calmness was more powerful than any raised voice could be. "Actually, I do belong here. My husband and I signed this lease legally. And for the record, I am Commander Reyes, recently appointed to oversee county operations within the sheriff's office." Her words hung in the air like thunder, and the deputy's eyes flickered briefly with pride as he stood silently by her side. The look on Karen's face was priceless. Her eyes bulged, her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and for once she had nothing to say. She tried to recover, stuttering out fragments. "See, Commander? Sheriff's office? That can't be right. You're lying. She's lying." But her voice lacked the conviction it had before. Even the neighbors who had been peeking from behind their curtains now stepped out further, whispering to one another in awe. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Karen knew it. The deputy cleared his throat, his voice sharper now. "Ma'am, you need to understand that you just called in a false report against my commanding officer. Do you have any idea how serious that is?" He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words made Karen stumble back a step. She waved her hands desperately, her earlier confidence crumbling. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know who she was? I was just doing my job as HOA president." Her excuses tumbled out one after another, but none of them carried any strength. And in that moment, I knew we had the upper hand. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with when she made that call. She thought she could control us, intimidate us, maybe even drive us out before we got settled. But now, standing in front of the woman who outranked the very deputy she had summoned, Karen was realizing she had just dug herself into a hole she couldn't climb out of. And the best part? My wife hadn't even raised her voice yet. The silence that followed my wife's introduction was deafening, like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath. Karen stood frozen, her hand still halfway in the air from pointing, her face pale as she tried to process what she had just heard. The deputy stood tall beside us, no longer just handling a routine call, but clearly showing respect to his superior officer. My wife didn't flinch, didn't gloat, and didn't even glance at Karen. She simply adjusted the strap of her watch and looked around the driveway like she was inspecting the scene. That kind of calm confidence unsettled Karen more than yelling ever could. She finally found her voice, though it came out shaky. "Commander? No, this doesn't make sense. She's not, she's just some woman with boxes. She can't be in charge of the sheriff's office." Her words tumbled out in disbelief, almost like she was trying to convince herself it wasn't true. The deputy cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with all due respect, she is exactly who she says she is. I report to her now. And that means you just accused your commanding officer of trespassing. He didn't hide the edge in his tone, and I caught the faintest smirk tugging at his lips, as though he too found the situation almost satisfying. Karen shook her head violently, refusing to accept what was happening. She pointed at the house again, her voice louder, trying to regain the control she had lost. This isn't about titles or ranks. This is about rules. This is my neighborhood. I've been running this HOA for 10 years, and I don't care if she's the sheriff or the president. No one moves in here without my approval. She stomped her foot as if that would add weight to her words, but the effect was almost childish. My wife finally turned to her, her expression calm but firm. You don't make the law, Karen. You don't have the authority to decide where people can live. This property is outside your HOA's jurisdiction, and you knew that before you called. What you did was harassment, plain and simple. The way she said it, with such authority and composure, made Karen falter again. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened once more like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. She ended up blurting, "But I'm the president," as if that title meant she could overrule the law itself. The deputy couldn't hold back a short chuckle. He quickly cleared his throat, straightened up again, and said, "Ma'am, being the HOA president doesn't give you any legal power over this property. In fact, making a false 911 call is a crime. You wasted county resources, and worse, you did it against my superior." Karen looked around, realizing for the first time that more neighbors were watching. Curtains twitched. Doors cracked open. A few people had even stepped out onto their lawns, phones in hand, probably recording every second of this meltdown. She could feel the eyes on her, and her cheeks turned bright red. Still, she refused to surrender. This is a misunderstanding. I was only trying to protect the neighborhood. You should be thanking me. I thought they were criminals, but my wife cut her off, her tone sharp enough to slice through the excuses. Stop. You didn't think we were criminals. You thought you could intimidate us. You thought you could scare us out before we even unpacked. And when that didn't work, you weaponized the police to try and enforce rules that don't even apply here. That's abuse of authority, Karen, and I won't tolerate it. Her words landed like hammer blows, and Karen flinched as if each one physically struck her. For a moment, Karen tried to laugh it off, though the sound came out shaky. Oh, come on. You can't be serious. What are you going to do, arrest me for calling the cops? I was just doing what any good HOA president would do. The deputy stepped closer then, his shadow falling across her. If it were up to me, I'd write you up right now for filing a false report. The only reason you're not in cuffs is because Commander Reyes hasn't decided what she wants to do with you yet. He nodded respectfully toward my wife, making it crystal clear who held the power. Karen's eyes widened in horror. Wait, she gets to decide? That's not fair. She's the one I called the cops on. That's a conflict of interest, she shrieked, her voice cracking. My wife didn't react to the outburst. Instead, she looked at the deputy. What's the protocol here? She asked coolly. The deputy explained that technically, Karen could be cited for misuse of emergency services and harassment, both of which carried hefty fines. The moment the words, hefty fines, left his mouth, Karen nearly choked. Fines? No, you can't. I was just doing my job. I have rights. It was almost pathetic now, watching her try to claw her way out of the mess she had made. My wife studied her for a moment, then said, "You're lucky this is day one, and I don't feel like dragging you into court. Consider this a warning. Next time you pull something like this, there won't be a conversation. You'll be facing charges." The calm way she said it, not raising her voice or showing any anger, made the threat all the more terrifying. Karen swallowed hard, her bravado collapsing entirely. She finally seemed to realize she was standing in front of someone who not only outranked her, but also couldn't be manipulated or bullied. The neighbors who had gathered didn't even bother hiding their amusement. A couple of them chuckled quietly, and one man muttered just loud enough for us to hear, "About time someone put her in her place." Karen whipped her head around, glaring at them, but no one came to her defense. She was alone. Completely exposed. My wife turned back toward the cabin, picked up another box, and carried it inside without another word. That simple act, choosing to move on instead of continuing the argument, was the final nail in Karen's coffin. It showed that she wasn't worth more than a few moments of attention. The deputy lingered a moment longer, looking at me with a small smile. "You've got nothing to worry about, sir. You and your wife are welcome here. If she says it's legal, then that's the end of the discussion." He tipped his hat toward the porch, then added, "Ma'am," addressing my wife inside, "welcome to the neighborhood." Then he turned and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Karen standing alone in the driveway, trembling with rage but too scared to say another word. As the cruiser pulled away, Karen finally spun on her heels and stormed off toward her house. She muttered under her breath, too quiet for us to catch the words, but her clenched fists and red face told the story. She had lost. Badly. And for once, she couldn't talk her way out of it. The rest of that scene played out like something straight from a drama, and if I hadn't been standing there myself, I might not have believed it. Karen was trembling, her lips pressed tightly together, her fists balled at her sides. She wanted so badly to snap back, to shout, to throw one more insult our way, but the weight of what had just happened kept her silent. For someone who had spent years lording her so-called authority over her neighbors, silence was probably the hardest punishment of all. She turned abruptly, her heels clicking against the pavement as she marched down the sidewalk, muttering incoherently. The neighbors who had gathered quickly pretended to look busy, some watering their lawns, others retreating inside with amused grins on their faces, but I caught the little smirks and heard the muffled chuckles. It was clear this wasn't the first time Karen had overstepped, but it was definitely the first time she had been completely shut down. I looked over at my wife, who had already gone back to unloading boxes as if nothing unusual had happened. That was her way, never let the drama distract from the task at hand. She carried herself with such calm authority that she didn't even need to raise her voice or gloat. She had won the battle the second the deputy recognized her and saluted. I leaned against the porch rail, watching her for a moment, then let out a laugh I had been holding in. "Well," I said, "that was one way to meet the neighbors." She glanced at me, smirked, and said, "I told you not to let people like her get under your skin. They always trip over their own power plays." Then she hoisted another box onto her shoulder and disappeared inside. Over the next hour, we finished unloading the truck. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, Karen peeking through her blinds, her face barely visible between the slats. She thought she was being subtle, but she wasn't. Each time, I'd wave cheerfully, which only made her duck back behind the curtains even faster. My wife ignored it entirely, humming to herself as she unpacked dishes in the kitchen, as if the whole ordeal hadn't even happened. But I knew better. She wasn't ignoring Karen out of fear, she was ignoring her because Karen no longer mattered. By late afternoon, the sun hung lower over the lake, casting golden light across the water. The cabin was slowly starting to feel like home. The smell of fresh wood mixed with the aroma of dinner cooking in the oven. I stepped outside to grab the last box, and that's when I noticed a couple of neighbors walking by, deliberately slowing their pace near our driveway. One of them, an older gentleman in a baseball cap, tipped his head toward me and said quietly, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Don't let Karen scare you off. She's been terrorizing people for years, but looks like you two finally put her in her place." I chuckled, shaking his hand. "Thanks. Something tells me she won't be trying that stunt again anytime soon." The man laughed. "Not after today." Half the neighborhood saw her get shut down. Trust me, word spreads fast around here. Sure enough, the following days confirmed it. Wherever my wife and I went, people were suddenly friendly, introducing themselves, offering to help with small things like lending tools or recommending local shops. It was as if standing up to Karen had unlocked some unspoken approval in the community. And Karen? She stayed quiet. Shockingly quiet. If she was outside at all, it was only briefly, and the moment she spotted us, she'd turn and retreat back inside. The same woman who had screamed into her phone, demanding our arrest, couldn't even make eye contact anymore. It was like she had been defanged, stripped of the false authority she'd wrapped herself in for so long. But Karen being Karen, she couldn't completely let go. About a week later, she left a note taped to our mailbox, written in sharp, angry handwriting. It was full of passive-aggressive comments about proper trash bin placement and keeping up neighborhood standards. My wife read it once, smiled faintly, then crumpled it up and tossed it straight into the recycling bin. "She's testing the waters," she said. "Trying to see if we'll take the bait." I asked if we should confront her, but my wife shook her head. "No. The worst thing you can do to someone like her is ignore her. She thrives on attention, and now she knows the sheriff's office has eyes on her. She won't risk pulling another stunt like last week." And she was right. The weeks turned into months, and Karen never dared call the cops on us again. She never barged into our driveway, never screamed across the street, never tried to block us from enjoying our home. The most she did was glare through her blinds, but even that lost its sting after a while. She had gone from self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood to a silent figure hiding in her own house. Every time I saw her peek out, I couldn't help but grin at the memory of the deputy saluting my wife right in front of her. That moment had been the turning point, the one thing Karen could never erase from the collective memory of the neighborhood. Looking back, I realize how close we came to having our moving day ruined completely. If my wife hadn't been who she was, if the deputy hadn't recognized her, Karen's lies could have dragged us into hours of frustration, maybe even legal trouble. But instead, it flipped completely, turning into a story that neighbors still whispered about whenever Karen's name came up. It was almost poetic justice. The woman who tried to weaponize the law ended up silenced by the very system she thought she controlled. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset over the lake, I asked my wife if she ever regretted stepping forward that day, if she ever wished she had just stayed quiet and let me handle it. She shook her head. No. People like her only stop when someone draws a line. It's not about showing power, it's about showing that intimidation doesn't work. She needed to learn that lesson, not just for us, but for everyone else she's bullied. I nodded, realizing how true that was. Because from that day on, Karen stopped harassing the other neighbors too. Maybe she was embarrassed, maybe she was scared, or maybe she just finally understood that her little kingdom wasn't hers to rule anymore. As the last light faded and the crickets began their nightly chorus, I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. We had our home, we had each other, and best of all, we had silenced the one person who thought she could take it all away before it even began. And every time I think back to that first day, I can still see it, the look on Karen's face the moment the sheriff's deputy snapped to attention and saluted my wife. A look of pure shock, the kind that said for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't the one in charge. And that silence? That silence was worth more than any victory I could have imagined.